Hello friends. In this video, I'm going to give you a very brief summary of each of the major sections of the Bible. In later videos, we'll get into the details. So the first section is known as the Torah, also known as the Pentateuch. In this section, it describes the creation of this world, the creation of man, the fall of man from God's presence, and God beginning his plan to restore man's place in paradise with him. Now, what we see in these first 5 books is that the first part of God's plan is that he selects an example. This example will be the nation of Israel. God is going to communicate with them and give them personal and intimate knowledge of what he expects from mankind. He's going to lay down the rules, the laws, and the consequences and set them into motion. Now, the nation of Israel falls far short of God's expectations and encounter a lot of problems. So what we see I'm jumping ahead. That gets us into the historical books. So the Torah ends with God establishing this nation of Israel and giving them the rules and expectations of them as his chosen people. That's where the book ends. That's where the series of 5 books ends. Now, we move into the next section, which are the historical books. The historical books cover Israel's journey through several hundred years as God's chosen people. And essentially what we see throughout these several historical books is that the nation of Israel knows what God expects of them, but is surrounded by pagan nations and enticed by these pagan nations. And so the leaders of Israel fluctuate back and forth between obeying God and adopting some of the forbidden practices of the pagan nations. When they obey God, he blesses the nation richly, protects them, and they live great lives. When the nation falls into disobedience, he punishes them. Now, the nation of Israel backslid away from God so much that he ultimately allowed them to be completely taken over by pagan nations. And that pretty much ends the history of Israel for a little over 400 years until Jesus comes. The next books we'll discuss are the collection of books known as the books of wisdom. Now, these books of wisdom get off of the historical narrative and explore the deep meanings of life. They explore man's search for meaning in life and man's relationship with God. It discusses topics such as suffering, such as romantic love. It discusses topics such as practical topics for how to live a successful life. And that's what it does. Each one of the books of wisdom included in this section cover different topics. Next, we get into the books of prophecy. There are several different books of prophecy given accounts of different prophets. And all of these prophets give communications from God to the nation of Israel. And most of these prophecies are warnings to Israel that God is aware of what is being done in secret, usually by the rulers, and there's punishment coming. So the prophets primarily functioned to warn Israel that their time was running short with God. And a couple of other prophets didn't warn Israel. They talked about other things. And some of these prophets talked about the coming of Jesus, which would take place, around 400 years later. And the prophets that spoke about Jesus gave very specific, clear, explicit details of how the nation of Israel would be able to recognize specifically who Jesus was. And let me see. And we have a couple of other prophets who did not warn Israel, and they did not prophesy primarily about Jesus. But what they did was they described and explained what the human activities looked like in the eyes of God. Very powerful stuff. And so what may have seemed harmless and mundane to the nation of Israel looked far different from a spiritual perspective, and the prophets, explain these things to the nation of Israel. Now, this ends the First Testament. And the way the First Testament ends is Israel just kept disobeying God too much. God showed time and time again that when they obeyed, he would bless them. When they disobeyed, he would punish them. And they ran out of options. They ran out of time. They got taken over by other nations. And God restored them back to a nation, partly. He let some of the nation just get taken over, never to return again. And part of the nation he allowed to come back just to keep the nation alive. But he stopped sending prophets to them, and they did not hear from God for over 400 years. Next, we'll begin these sections of the New Testament. The first section of the New Testament are the 4 Gospels of King Jesus Christ. Now, these are 4 different accounts of Jesus's ministry on earth. I say his ministry and not his life because there's no discussion about what happened before he formally began his mission. So these 4 different accounts focus on different aspects of Jesus's ministry. One account focuses on the historical details, like this happened, then that happened, and that happened. Another account focuses on the teachings that Jesus gave to the people. Another account ties in the prophecies that took place in the Old Testament and shows how they all tie in to Jesus. Okay? And then there's another perspective that focuses on the miracles of Jesus. All right? They all fit perfectly together like a hand in glove. They're all written by different apostles who are eyewitnesses to Jesus. And except for one, the book of Luke, he was not one of Jesus's apostles, but he received the story from one of Jesus's apostles, and he recorded it. All right. And so by the time you get through the Gospels, you have heard all of Jesus's words that took place during his ministry. Next, we have not a section, but a transitional book called the Acts of the Apostles. After Jesus's death and resurrection, he ascended into heaven, and before he ascended into heaven, he gave instructions to his apostles. The book of Acts explains what was going on with the apostles shortly after that. We then get into, and what happened was they received the promise of the gift of the Holy Spirit that Jesus had promised them, which, when Jesus, this is an interesting point, when God took on a human form and walked the earth as Jesus, he did not give himself supernatural powers. All of his abilities to do miracles came from the Holy Spirit that that lived in him. And Jesus promised to give the Holy Spirit to his apostles and told them that they would do miracles just as he did, and even much more. So the book of Acts describes them receiving the Holy Spirit and beginning to carry on Jesus' ministry and build the church of Jesus Christ. All right, that's all in one book. It's a very action-packed book. All right, now we get to the next section, which is the epistles. Now, the epistles are letters of instruction and guidance written by the apostles to the new believers. And they cover every single aspect of what it means to live life as a servant of Jesus Christ. Now, the formal man-made church institutions that came up, such as the Roman Catholic Church and later on the Protestant Church, those came up hundreds of years after this. Okay, those are man-made interpretations that are mixed in together with politics, mixed in together with pagan culture, all this other stuff. That's a man-made church. And a lot of the religions, not a lot of the religions, all of the Christian religions and all the Christian churches are man-made things that have some good things in them and other stuff that mankind added into it. But if you want to know the original church and what that is supposed to look like, it's all here in the epistles. Next, we have the book of Revelations. Okay, just like the book of Acts, it's not a section. It is one book. Now, the book of Revelation is a book of future prophecy, how all this stuff is going to end when Jesus returns. And it explains pretty much everything that you can imagine. And it describes all of the false teaching about Jesus that the kingdom of darkness spread around by having people disguise themselves as so-called Christians, but spreading lies in order to deceive people. It describes Jesus's destruction of the kingdom of darkness, which rules over our present world, and it describes the next earth age, which will be the third earth age, in which God will create a new heaven and a new earth, and all of those who have been saved by Jesus will receive new forms, new bodies to exist in this new environment. All right. In the following videos, which there will be a lot, approximately 66 of them, I'm going to go into summaries of each individual book. And then I'm going to follow those up later on by getting into details and discussions and things like that. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next video.